The second lesson comes from the Gospel of Luke, beginning at verse 28 in chapter 9. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While Peter was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one of any of the things they had seen. This is the word of the Lord. Now, before you get too comfortable, I'm going to invite you into this experience of transfiguration by first inviting you to stand and gather all your belongings with you. Now I'm going to ask you, as you are able, to move, to find some new place to sit in the sanctuary. Move as much as you can, back to front, over to Christ Chapel, up to the balcony. Even the choir can change places, or you can come sit with the choir. And I'm going to move too. Now that you're in this new place, take a look around. Who's worshiping with you? Are there some people you haven't seen for a while, or maybe you haven't even met these folks? Does it look different? Does it feel different to you to be in this other place than where you started out, and perhaps the place where you normally sit? It's a little disorienting, and yet, as you look around at this new space, the table and the font are still here, aren't they? As you look in the pew, there are hymnals and Bibles, but this may be a different experience of worship, being in a new place surrounded by new neighbors. Now, if you have a pencil or pen handy, I'm going to invite you to write a couple of words on your bulletin so you see where we're going this morning. The words are these: orientation, disorientation, new orientation. So let me say that again a little more slowly. First word is orientation. Basically the way things are, where things are now. Disorientation, disruption, change. New orientation, coming into a new place out of that disorientation. Okay? Walter Brueggemann uses this scheme of orientation, disorientation, new orientation to talk about the Psalms, and I thought it fit fairly well with this story of the Transfiguration and what you've just been through and what we're going through in our lives. Earlier in chapter 9 in Luke, the disciples have come back from a mission trip on which Jesus has sent them. And they're feeling pretty good about themselves. They healed, they taught, things are going well. People are looking up to them. This is a pretty good place to be. So they're oriented toward the present time and maybe having that present time continue. Then Jesus invites them to a time apart and asks them, "Who are people saying that I am?" And they answer him. And then Jesus looks at them and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter blurts out, "You're the Son of God." Little inkling of disorientation. What does that mean, that this might be the Son of God? Maybe it means they're going to be rulers, sweep away the Romans, come into a place of glory. Could be pretty exciting, but they're not sure what that means. And in case they get too excited about what it means to be hanging out with the Son of God, Jesus tells them, "I'm going to Jerusalem to die." Whoa. "But my death will not be the last word." They hear about the death of Jesus. In fact, the translations often say his exodus from Jerusalem. The disciples hear this, and deep within them has to become a feeling of disorientation, of things becoming out of kilter. Nothing happens for a week, and then Jesus goes to a mountain to pray and invites Peter, John, and James to go with him. And after they've climbed the mountain, the disciples are a tad sleepy. But before they sleep, they look at Jesus and they see he is completely changed. While he is there is light around and through him. He is transfigured. The disciples would have learned in synagogue that when you see this kind of light, that signifies the presence of God. And this has got to be scary, because they also learned that if you see the presence of God, you may die. So here's Jesus, the person they know, who's commissioned them, who suddenly looks very different. And then there are two figures with him that they identify as Moses and Elijah. This is a completely disorienting experience. They don't know what to do. But Peter, ever wanting to do something, wants to build booths, wants to hold on to this present, no matter how unusual it is, capture it, keep it where we can contain it, not be disoriented by it. But before he can get very far, a voice comes out of a cloud that is moving over them. The voice speaks to them. Now, those of us who live in Northeast Ohio, or have for a while, have probably had to deal with fogs or those blinding snowstorms. And you know what happens when you try to put your high beams on so you can see clearly? The light bounces back at you. You can't do that. Low beams, slow driving, trust your sense of the road, trust God to be with you. That is how you go through the fog, the cloud. Probably lots of prayer as well in those times. The disciples are in a fog. Peter's words from a week earlier are confirmed. This is the Son of God. The words that some of them may have heard when Jesus entered the Jordan River with John. "This is my son. Listen to him," are heard again. But listen to what? His words to the crowds wanting to be fed? His words to distraught parents or others seeking healing? His words about coming death and resurrection? His words about establishing a kingdom? His words welcoming all people? What was it they were to listen to? You can imagine their confused thoughts as they are surrounded by this cloud. The voice says only 9 words, and then the cloud disappears. And Jesus is there, back to his usual self. There are no other figures. It seems like the beginning of the event, but it's not. It's not back to normal. In fact, it's so disorienting to these disciples that they will not speak about it until after the resurrection. They can't speak about it. It makes no sense to them. This story of the Transfiguration is always told on the Sunday before we begin the period of Lent. It points us toward a time which is upon us when we too may enter a time of disorientation. Some of us will change our behavior. We may give up food. We may add on service. We may move into a time of increased study or prayer. It may be a time for us to reflect more deeply on our faith and on who Jesus is for us and what we are called to do in this time and place. And hopefully, for each of you this Lent, it will become a time of some disorientation, some time of letting loose to what you have held on to and moving towards some new understanding, some new growth in spirit. M. Scott Peck, the author of People of the Lie, writes that it is in times when we are disoriented, when we are out of sync, when we are struggling, that we have the most growth, that we see out of our discomfort and out of our known and usual places new possibilities for ourselves. The Church of the Covenant is going through a time of disorientation itself. As the year began, leadership was in place, issues were known, plans were made for worship and service. These were unfolding, and then a major change occurs. The head of staff pastor announces that she is leaving. Disorientation. Things are not going to be the way they were. There is going to be change. What is ahead is not completely known, and perhaps it's a bit scary. Then comes some disorientation with the building. The roof in the education center is leaking. The nursery has to be moved. The handbells have to be moved. The choir has to be moved. Everything is changing in the building. Those changes may not have affected you. You may not even know that we've made those changes, but we have. We've already been through some changes. We've renovated downstairs into the Dowd Commons. We've repurposed some of the rooms in the education building. It is a time of some disorientation, and yet there are things that are familiar that we hold on to. Staff come and go, but there is staff. Members come and go, and yet this community remains as a place of worship and service. The neighborhood around us is changing. When I served on the staff of this church many years ago, there was no Seidman Cancer Center. If you looked up Cornell Road, all you saw were apartment buildings, no university hospital intruding on that space. If you looked down Euclid Avenue, you saw a couple of old parking lots and some dingy building, but no new apartments, no eateries, nothing exciting. Certainly no museum at the intersection of Mayfield and Euclid, or a Peter B. Lewis building, or a new art museum addition, or the nature walk, and I could go on. The neighborhood has changed drastically. Some of it planned, some of it out of necessity, but we don't stay where we are, and we get disoriented with those changes. We look at our own lives. Some of us already have, and all of us will go through times where we face perhaps rapid and drastic changes in our careers, our health, our relationships. It's a time of being out of kilter, of being disoriented. The story of the Transfiguration reminds us that no matter what happens or how disoriented we become, God will always be with us. God will be present, and God's love will never change for us. There is nothing that can happen to us. There is nothing that we can do that can ever separate us from God's care and God's love. All that the disciples experienced on that mountain, all that they experienced as they traveled with Jesus to Jerusalem through the crucifixion and resurrection, were not outside of God's care and God's love. And no matter how disoriented they became, God was with them. And no matter what happens to us in our lives, how disoriented we may become with what is surrounding us, God will be with us, and God will walk with us. This morning, as we come to the Lord's table, we come through ones who've been through a bit of disorientation. We've changed our usual place where we sat, and the people who usually sit with us aren't there exactly in the same way, except we know they're in the building. We're a bit out of step, except that the table is still here, and we know that God is present in this place. God offers us this time of worship, offers us this sacrament of renewal as a means to equip us for the days ahead, to make us ready as Christ's disciples to move not only into Lent, but out into a world that so badly needs good news, so badly needs to be assured that God is present and that God loves us. It is a time for us to take in this love of God, but not to stay here, not to make this place the place where we stay, but the place that renews us and sends us out into the world. May you begin your Lenten season relying on God's presence with you, even as you go through the changes in your own life, in the life of this congregation, and the life of the community. Know that God will be with you, and God will go with you through all of these times. Amen.